exploited. So my question is that an area where government is going to make the world better? A lot of people who love free markets argue that the key central role of government is antitrust, because you got to make sure that markets are competitive. Yeah. True or false?
Absolutely false, although I understand that even most economists today disagree, because most economists, I think, don't stop to think seriously about what antitrust really is, and they don't, frankly, as you alluded to, they take their language and their models a bit too seriously. Just because an industry does not have an infinite number of firms does not mean that industry is monopolized, which is, or has monopoly power, which, as you know, that's the common language. Here's an instance where knowledge of history is very useful. Let me say before I go on, historical pedigree doesn't prove anything about current reality, but it does shed light on that reality. So one of the few pieces of serious archival research that I've done in my career is on the history of U.S. antitrust laws. Of course, people say the first antitrust statute in the world was the Sherman Act, which was passed in July of 1890 by the U.S. Congress. That's not correct. The first pieces of antitrust legislation were state antitrust statutes that were enacted beginning in 1889, so just a year before the Sherman Act, and they continued to be enacted at the state level in 1890 and 1891, maybe even a handful in 1892. And you look at the origins of these statutes.
I have to interrupt here. I think most people say, well, the origins were, well, you have the robber barons.
That's right.
They went out, they were making a lot of money, they had monopolies, they were exploiting the consumer, and so the government had to step in to help people.
That's the standard story, that prior to the Gilded Age, up until, say, 1870 or so, America was a decentralized, highly competitive economy, and then for whatever reason, maybe the railroad, the telegraph, just personalities, who knows, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the James B. Dukes, all became very powerful. We had these robber barons, and they started screwing consumers. And then Congress looked at this and said, by golly, we can't let this go on, and so we'll
stand up for the little guy.
We'll pass the Sherman Act, and because we care about consumers. The first hint that this story is maybe not all that accurate. You get the first hint when you realize that Senator John Sherman himself was the sponsor in the Senate, the chief sponsor in the Senate, for the McKinley Tariff, which was passed in October of 1890, just 3 months after the Sherman Act, which at the time was the largest tariff increase in U.S. history. And so in July, he was the consumer's friend, and in October, he was the consumer's enemy, because he was enacting a tariff. Again, the economists think of the Sherman Act as this economically pristine piece of legislation. Now, economists also understand that tariffs are a tool for granting monopoly power to certain domestic producers. Put that aside. It was because of that I and some other colleagues at the time started researching these things. And so what we discovered is that the industries that were singled out in the press and in congressional debate and in state debate as being among the most monopolized, they were, number one, they were industries that were growing large on a national scale because the railroads were growing and telegraphs were spreading. But prices in those industries were also falling by more than the average price fall. It was a period of slight gentle deflation because outputs were increasing so heavily. It was a gold standard era, so the money supply wasn't increasing. And outputs in those industries were expanding by more than outputs in the economy in general. And so if you just look at the evidence, this was first gathered, as far as I know, by my former GMU colleague Tom DiLorenzo in a really fine 1985 article that he published in the International Review of Law and Economics. And so there's no evidence of monopoly.
Let's get the claim straight. So the claim was that these giant corporations, these large companies were exploiting consumers as sort of the received wisdom.
Standard Oil, American Tobacco, Carnegie Steel.
And yet, apparently, even though they were growing, which on the surface might lead you to conclude that they were powerful because they had a big market share, they were not using that market share to exploit consumers. They were actually benefiting consumers. Is that the claim?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Hard to believe.
Well, look, you can look at the data, and there it is. The prices in those industries were declining faster than the prices in the economy as a whole, and the outputs were rising faster than the outputs in the economy as a whole. So then you look at who actually lobbied for antitrust. It was producers. It was the small, and this is a relatively unknown story, although Gary Leibkap, also the great economic historian, he was at Arizona. He may have moved, but Gary did this work independent of myself and Tom DiLorenzo. We both came to the same conclusion just about the same time, that it really got sparked by activities in the meatpacking industry. One of my great heroes is Gustavus Swift, who was a middle-class butcher in Boston, and he had the brainstorm that he could make a lot of money by centralizing the slaughtering and distribution of beef, chicken, and pork. So he set up a slaughterhouse in Chicago, which was a major rail terminal, and very quickly, within a matter of years, just a few years, he was shipping beef all across the country.
He also had the innovation that had come along of the refrigerated rail car.
Refrigerated railroad car, which enabled him, because prior to refrigerated railroad cars, all slaughtering had to be done pretty much on site. So those are the days when butchers were truly butchers, not just meat slicers as they are today. And so he was shipping beef, lamb, and pork all across the country, and the prices of beef from 1879, when he shipped his first load of slaughtered beef east to Chicago for his brother to sell. By 1886, the price had fallen for the consumer by about 30% in real terms. That's a huge decline. The butchers and the independent cattlemen, who before had very secure, very predictable markets for the local economies, they were undercut by these meat packers. And because Swift's firm was so profitable, he quickly had other major competitors in meat packing, and that was a hugely explosive industry in the 1880s. And it's that industry, I'm convinced, and the reaction to that industry that sparked antitrust. Antitrust emerged in the United States not because prices were rising and outputs were falling, which is a standard story economists believe, but because the economy was becoming so competitive.
So much more dynamic.
And the old line producers who were suffering because of this dynamism, they complained, and they got the ear first of the state legislatures and then of Congress to try to halt this competition. And antitrust was an attempt to halt that competition.